to the stage. Well, first of all, dear friend, Ambassador John Herbst, Director of the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, former ambassador of the U.S. to NATO and Russia, our longtime ally, General David Lute. I also invite to the stage Ms. Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze. She's somewhere around here. She's head of the Parliamentary Committee for Ukraine's European integration, and Arseniy Yatsenyuk, head of the Kyiv Security Forum, Prime Minister of Ukraine in 2014 to 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. So, we're meeting today in this wonderful premises, which has become a kind of traditional for Kyiv Security Forum. And this building is, on the one hand, a kind of metaphor, and on the other hand, it's a sign of the fact that we are in insecurity and we will prevail and no one will be able to harm our security. Today we're going to discuss the topic which is directly related to national security. We will present a special document, a memo of the Atlantic Council to the President of the United States about supporting Ukraine with special emphasis on the preparation to the forthcoming NATO Summit in Washington in 2024.
And this is my pleasure to present the idea which was introduced to the Kyiv Security Forum by the Atlantic Council, to present the document, the memo addressed to the President of the United States by the Atlantic Council, and I'm really happy that we have this opportunity to introduce this document to the Ukrainian audience. So, John, I would like to invite you and to share with us your opinion, your idea, to explain what stands behind that document. You're welcome.
Does this work?
Yep.
Daniel, thank you very much. It's great to be here to see a lot of old friends. The genesis of this document goes back to the NATO summit in Vilnius in July. And many Americans who pay close attention to our interest in Eastern Europe were disappointed with the results of that summit. We felt that NATO could have made taken a stronger step towards Ukraine's membership in the alliance. And we decided then and there that we were going to put together a group of experts, former senior officials, to look at what could be done to expedite Ukraine's NATO membership at the Washington Summit next year. So at the end of July, we assembled about 25 very smart people, 3 former ambassadors to NATO, U.S. ambassadors to NATO, 2 of whom were on this panel, former assistant secretaries of state, former heads of, former chief of forces in Europe. And we worked 3 long roundtables, many hundreds of emails, and came up with the document that you see. You might say there are 3 main messages. Darn those Russians. That's better. There are 3 main messages in our memorandum to the President. The first is we face a major, or maybe the major, strategic challenge in an aggressive Kremlin's foreign policy. And our support for Ukraine is not philanthropy to a friend, but a smart investment in American interests, to protect American interests. And we encouraged the administration, the president, to speak out strongly and clearly about that danger. Now, I would like to take credit, we would like to take credit for the president's excellent speech last Thursday. It wasn't our doing, but he largely met that objective with his speech when he told the American people properly that if Putin were to win in Ukraine, which will not happen as long as American support is strong, he would then go after our NATO allies in the Baltics, maybe Poland, and so the danger to the United States, the cost of the United States would be far greater than the assistance we are providing to Ukraine. In talking about what would be necessary for a strong step towards Ukraine's NATO membership in Washington, we realized that it was critical to improve Ukraine's military prospects in the war with Russia. So the second part of our paper, and actually the first part is just an introduction, is all about the weapons you need and why. And Ambassador Lute, General Lute, will talk about that. And then the third part of our paper is the actual proposal on NATO. And Sandy Vershbow, both a U.S. ambassador to NATO and a deputy Sec General of NATO, will discuss that. Now, over to Doug.
Well, as John Herbst just outlined, the paper makes two ambitious or aggressive recommendations for the Washington Summit, now 9 months from now, right? The first major recommendation is that we should give Ukraine what it needs to win the war. That's the part I'll talk about. And then I'll pass to Ambassador Vershbow, because the second part of the memo says we should do what's necessary to secure the peace. So it's a two-part: win the war, secure the peace. On win the war, the memo calls for a very different approach, a fresh approach to giving Ukraine the military capabilities it needs. We argue that there is a qualitative requirement here, the quality of the weapons. There's a quantitative requirement, and there's a timing requirement. And on all three of these criteria, we have so far fallen short of what's required to win the war. I would argue personally, it doesn't say this in the paper, but I'd argue that we've given Ukraine enough not to lose, but not enough to win. And we believe it's essential that we change this dynamic and we give fully Ukraine what is required to win. Now, we also disagree with the current approach in that it has been slow, it has been bureaucratic, and it has been incremental, step by step. And in each iteration of the military assistance, it has therefore arrived too late. And frankly, as a former military officer, I appreciate that that means that Ukrainians have borne the price of that approach. And we call for that approach to end and for us to get serious about winning the war. Now, let me just give you one specific example. The paper goes further and is more ambitious to suggest that it is time to end the sanctuary inside Russia for locations, military locations, from which attacks on Ukraine are launched. So this means that we call for the provision of sufficient weapons to place at risk Russian air bases, Russian naval bases, from which attacks on Ukraine are launched. That's a dramatically different approach than the approach currently being pursued by the United States and our allies. So this is a pretty stark shift in military support. That's the win the war part of this paper, And let me turn now to my colleague, Sandy Vershbow, about the second part.
Thanks very much, Doug. And thanks to the Kyiv Security Forum for this opportunity to present our recommendations, which we're hoping will stir up a little additional debate, both in Washington, but across the alliance. As my colleagues have already said, there are two major recommendations. Doug has laid out the need for a much more concerted, non-incremental approach to ensure that Ukraine not just avoids losing, but actually can win the war. But let me talk about the other major recommendation, which is starting a process or setting Ukraine on a path toward NATO membership. All the authors, signatories of our memo may have had some differences of opinion on some issues, but they all agreed that in the long term, membership in NATO is the only truly reliable security guarantee for Ukraine. So we need to at least begin a process at the Washington Summit. Vilnius was, I think, clearly a missed opportunity. It said the right words, that Ukraine's future is in NATO, and it did some useful things such as simplifying the process for Ukrainian accession, including dropping the requirement for a membership action plan. But it was a missed opportunity to actually move decisively beyond the 2008 Bucharest Summit and the Vilnius decisions. So NATO's 75th anniversary is obviously an appropriate occasion for big decisions, and we think it's an appropriate occasion to take concrete steps that define Ukraine's path toward membership, at least get the wheels turning inside NATO, even though membership itself may not happen overnight. Now, we don't pretend that it's a simple decision for NATO. While Germany was admitted in 1955 when part of its territory was occupied by Soviet troops, this would be the first time the alliance would seek to bring in a country engaged in active combat with a hostile neighbor. And any movement toward Ukrainian membership would also need to be compatible with the current US and alliance policy not to become combatants in the current conflict. Now, if Ukraine were heading toward victory, as we all wish, with the fighting coming to an end, we could follow the NATO enlargement script used most recently with Finland and Sweden. An invitation to NATO membership, followed by accession talks, signature of an accession protocol, and ratification. But it seems like unlikely we'll be in a position to do that at the time of the Washington Summit. We need to be prepared for different, more ambiguous scenarios in which the conflict continues. Now, some allies have suggested that the position should be simply that Ukrainian accession will only be possible after the war is over. That might be a simple approach, but it would give Russia an incentive to drag out the conflict indefinitely, and it would be tantamount to giving Russia a permanent veto on Ukraine and on NATO decision-making. So our approach flips the script, changes the sequence. We would invite Ukraine to begin accession talks at the Washington Summit and start working on some of those thorny issues that would be involved in bringing a country in that is not yet deoccupied all of its territory. And we would leave the actual invitation to NATO membership for a subsequent later political decision. So the US and NATO would show that they were being serious in starting a process, but they would leave an invitation to actual membership for that later decision. Now, the timing for Ukraine's actual accession would be left open, giving allies in Ukraine time to work out solutions to problems related to bringing in a member still engaged in a war with Russia. For example, in a scenario in which Russia still occupied some parts of Ukrainian territory, we might proceed with accession, but apply Article 5 only to territory fully under Ukrainian control. But these are different options. They would need to be discussed first and foremost with Ukraine. It's Ukraine's territory that we're trying to help secure. And getting a head start on the accession talks, even before an invitation to membership, would allow us to tackle those issues together. So some of the people who take an orthodox approach to the NATO documents might say that this is not quite what we had in mind when we launched the enlargement process 30 years ago. But I would argue that Ukraine is a unique and special case. It calls for a specially tailored approach, and I think the proposal we have offered would do just that. At least start the process, show the Russians that they don't have the ability to veto Ukraine's NATO aspirations, and hopefully see a time not too long after the Washington Summit when we can actually begin to move Ukraine through that open door.
I thank you, Mr. Secretary. That was, let me say that was dynamic, substantial, and brief. And Excellencies, we would like to thank you very much for presenting this document and sharing with us your opinion and your approaches. John told me that it will take only 15 minutes for them to present that document, and this is true. But I believe that we all look forward to further discussion, just to see, to go into the depth of the matter. Before I pass the floor to Ivanka, I would like to say that it goes without saying that we highly appreciate what the Atlantic Council is doing for Ukraine, and we highly appreciate the solidarity with our nation in the darkest hour of our history, of our modern history. Certainly, we have some topics that we argue about, and that's absolutely natural and normal, but what's important that today you presented a document which gives, I would say, a roadmap or some kind of benchmarks that we may receive, that we can get at the NATO summit in Washington. And that's a good example of addressing the president. I believe that Ukraine's president will also listen to what you suggested, since it sounds like a reasonable formula in the current circumstances. And now I would like to ask Ivana Klimpur-Sensadze. Ivanko, what's your take? Why do you think this is important to start discussing the language of the upcoming NATO summit in Washington, to start it right now? Why it is important to start these political preparations for the forthcoming summit in the United States? You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Danilo. Thank you to Kyiv Security Forum for both initiating this discussion, for reaching out to our colleagues in Atlantic Council, and also for this kind invitation. Let me just maybe start from a little bit of reflection, of my personal reflections after I read this memo, and start with the gratitude that I think that Atlantic Council has tried to suggest this much bolder agenda that we are dealing, rather than that one that we are dealing with as of now. And obviously, I think it's very pleasant for many of us Ukrainians who have been trying over these years to upbeat the support of our partners across Euro-Atlantic space. And it's important that we see some of the reflection of those ideas that we've been trying to put on the table in this memo. And that speaks definitely to our both hearts and minds. For example, I've been using the need to increase the quantity, quality, and the urgency of delivering of weapons, probably on each and every single diplomatic meeting or parliamentary meeting that we had, and definitely this is very well reflected in your paper. I think that General would agree with me that any military commander, once planning the successful or any military operation, has to have all the possible resources at hand. And that's exactly what our military commanders have been lacking over this period of time, because it's not that they had everything at hand in order to efficiently plan their counteroffensives, their defenses, and so on. And we have seen this dripping type of military support towards Ukraine, all these discussions that have been taking place in Rammstein formats, then great important political decisions that have been taken, like the one on, for example, on tank coalition, but then it takes months and months and months to actually implement it. I do remember that early April of 2022, it was the first trip of Ukrainian parliamentarians to Washington, D.C., and we had this pretty heated discussion in the Pentagon on whether or not it's a good idea to actually start already training of Ukrainian pilots for F-16s. And I remember that we were saying, you will give us those F-16s. It will just take time, so why don't you just start training them now? So definitely, you know, all of this is incredibly important in order for Ukraine to actually win in the battlefield. So this is first great thing that you are doing in this paper, in this memo. The second great thing that I really appreciate in this memo is actually when our friends are finally formulating that the West should be with Ukraine not just as long as it takes, but as long as it takes to win, for Ukraine to win, moreover, as long as it takes for Russia to be defeated. And I'm very grateful for that. I think this is incredibly important in order to be on the same wavelength and all of us understand what we are targeting at and what should be the result of this defensive war that we are fighting on our soil. And the third thing, and that brings me to both answering your question, Danilo, why this is important right now to start discussing the agenda and the possible outcome for the NATO Washington Summit, is actually your suggestion in terms of ways how to upgrade yet again the relationship with Ukraine. And here, you know, from the point of view of a Ukrainian, obviously we would like to dream even bigger. And I will maybe do some make some provocative statements, maybe that will lead us to additional brainstorming here in this audience. Because from my perspective, I think Ukraine NATO membership, that's one of the things that can actually end this war. And if we take the decision on invitation, some format of engagement that will already put a full stop in the question marks that Russia is trying to raise vis-a-vis our Western partners with regard to future Ukraine's membership. I think that will allow for us to look for certain ways how to implement that. That definitely requires a unity in the alliance. And we understand that there is, at this particular moment, we are not seeing this unity with regard to, let's say, fast-tracking in some way or clearly defining in some way how this process could be made. But if that decision was implicit already, and if we had the US leadership at this particular moment to try to create that unity around final decision of Ukraine being invited and then followed through on this path to NATO membership, I think then we would be much more efficient and much more creative in terms of finding the ways how to do that. Because that could you know, we can go into details a little bit later. There are other possibilities how to, for example, proceed and how to ensure that already now, in the nearest time, irrespectively, and that is, please correct me whether I read the paper, the memo right, irrespectively of whether the conflict is finalized, finished, stopped or not. Because as Sandy has rightly pointed out, as soon as we have any implicit idea that future of Ukraine's membership in NATO depends on the end of this conflict, that only indulges Russian Federation to continue it for, you know, for decades. And that is also limiting our ability to find the ways how to engage Ukraine. So I think it's definitely very important to already put ideas on the table. I think it's important to engage politicians, decision makers, ministers, executives into these discussions. And I think what's very important, why this has to be already done now, that we are actually showing that the analytical cohort, that the policy-making cohort who has the experience is backing and understanding the geopolitical importance of Ukraine being part of the world of good, as opposed to that axis of evil that has been formed and that we all recognize that it's already acting pretty actively.
Thank you very much, Ivanko. I believe that this discussion, and by the way, I believe that your paper and this discussion start an important path towards the Washington Summit. And now comes Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, you were a man who signed in 2008, co-signed a letter to NATO Secretary General requesting NATO membership action plan for Ukraine. So that was the beginning of the big process which led to an idea of joining the alliance. What do you think about this formula which is suggested in the paper presented by our friends to start negotiation, to start actually the accession process? You're welcome.
Thank you, Danilo. And it has been 15 years since the date when we asked NATO member states to support Ukraine and to grant membership action plan. In the end, you know, Russians invaded Georgia, Russians illegally annexed Crimea, Russians did a mass in Syria. So Russians committed a number of crimes and massacres. So we have to draw the lessons. I would start with my high appreciation to our friends from the Atlantic Council. Our distinguished dignitaries, you are doing an amazing job. And let me try to interpret the messages that have been delivered by our ambassadors and the general to the Ukrainian public. So what are we talking about, actually? We are talking about the thing, whether Ukraine is to be a member of NATO or no. So the Atlantic Council presented a clear-cut path. This is the roadmap. It's not a hot air. It's not a lip service. This is the roadmap how to make it done, period. We can deliberate over a number of technical issues. But let me tell you, that's not about technical deliberations. This is about the history. The history has to be made, and Ukraine is to become a NATO member state. This is the only way how to save the Ukrainian state, how to protect the Ukrainian people, and how to restore the global order. Ambassador Herbst, he cited President Biden, and let me do the same. First of all, we commend really his very strong address to the American people. And President Biden, he was very blunt and open, saying to the American people, look, folks, this is the best investment in the United States national security to help Ukraine. So this is the truth. And President Biden was very open-minded when in Israel he said that we don't have to be consumed by the rage. Let me add, we don't have to be consumed by the fear of Russians. And in your paper, it seems that you somehow combined realpolitik, which is a tough spot, with the incentive, with the real incentive, how to make Ukraine a NATO member state. There is no other option for the Ukrainian people and actually for the entire free world rather than to make Ukraine a NATO member state. And I believe that you have the ear of the President of the United States, and the toughest job, the real tall order would be to convince everyone in NATO to be on the same page. And I want to focus particularly on a number of NATO member states, like Hungary. I hope Turkey won't do the same as Turkey did with Sweden, that they will be on a fast track to help Ukraine to access NATO as quick as possible. In terms of so-called invitation, because the Ukrainian people, they are not students of this kind of complicated official language of NATO. What the hell is invitation? So invitation is actually to start an accession process, as far as I understand, right? And an accession process is a technical stage how to make Ukraine a NATO member state. And it takes, and I deliberately double-checked a number of countries that started an accession talks, and the deadline for the final decision, for the ultimate decision to make this country a NATO member state. It takes from 6 to 8, if I'm not mistaken, months in different cases to make these kind of states full-fledged members. So as distinguished ambassadors already were very clear saying that we need to craft special procedures for Ukraine, as Ukraine is a special and a separate case. So I do believe that in Washington, the decision will be made. I do share some takes that not only American, but even Ukrainian people, they were disenchanted with the decision of Vilnius Summit. But I strongly believe that the Washington Summit will be the decision, will be the real effort, the final decision for the Ukrainian people to make Ukraine a NATO member and actually to show to the entire world that we are not scared, that we believe in the free world, and we are ready to defend the free world together with Ukraine.
I thank you. And now we turn to our questions, to the distinguished speakers. And I would invite the audience to participate in that. But before that, let me ask our distinguished guest to answer just a few things that I believe are needed to be clarified. Arseniy Yatsenyuk well pointed that this is something between a realistic and idealistic approach, just to find this practical way how to reach that goal of Ukraine's accession into the NATO. There is an important task to have the accession talks not as never-ending story, because we need to have some time limits. For instance, Macedonia experienced 10 years from the political decision to be invited into the alliance and to finally do it. So here's the point: how to make it, how to introduce this language at the summit, but then how to ensure that this process is never ended. I know that you have already introduced this, you have already shown this paper to the administration and to your colleagues from the State Department. If I may, what was the reaction? What do you think, what people in DC think about your document? John, you're welcome.
I think we all know, as already mentioned by Doug and Sandy, that the administration has been overly cautious in defining and defending American interests in Moscow's aggression against Ukraine. So the weapons we've sent have come slowly, reluctantly sending the more advanced weapons, not in the right quantities and not with the right speed. And we saw at the Vilnius NATO Summit a comparable approach from the administration regarding steps towards expediting Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO. That's why we wrote this paper. So yes, we did present this to the administration before we went public. We were all former officials. We thought that was the right thing to do. We had excellent discussions both in the State Department and then separately at the National Security Council. As we expected, they thought that we were too ambitious. And I think that that's all we need to say.
I see. Okay, that sounds interesting, but it sounds encouraging that we can convince the administration that the approach you choose is right. I will pass the floor. Yep, you're welcome.
As I mentioned at the top, we took a very hard look at how we'd be most ambitious at the Washington NATO Summit. We decided that there were some very difficult issues that we could not resolve that got in the way of actually extending a straight-out invitation. So we came up with an alternate formula. And at the same time, we came to realize once again, it's not the first time, how important in getting the right weapons, the more advanced weapons in the adequate quantities, and quick to Ukraine.
I see. And now I would like to invite Ambassador Vershbow, since I would like to put the question in the wider context. We all listen to the great speech delivered by President Biden. A strong message to Israel and Ukraine, the strong message to the free world, and strong message to the all humankind, since this is war between good and bad. My question is that what do you think about what's going on in DC? How would you explain it to the Ukrainian audience? Because on one hand, we have the strong message from President Biden. On another hand, we all follow some kind of difficult, hard domestic dispute in the House and in the Congress. How we will get out from that? You're welcome. What do you think, what is the perspective of this political process?
Yeah, I think it's not a very encouraging period in American politics right now, particularly when one of the major parties seems to be fighting with itself. But hopefully that will not go on forever, because I think on the issue that we're talking about today, European security, Ukraine's place in the future European security system, there is still a lot of bipartisan consensus. There is a wing of the Republican Party that is turned against supporting Ukraine. But if they can get their act together in terms of how the Congress does its business, I'm optimistic that there will be a compromise decision that provides the additional aid to Israel and to Ukraine. And I think the President used that opportunity extremely well to explain why these cases are so similar. They're both about democratic nations, friends and allies of the United States. They're both countries whose very existence is being threatened by hostile neighbors, Hamas and Putin's Russia, and that U.S. interests in a secure Europe and a secure world would be seriously jeopardized if they basically get away with this, if somehow the system that we thought we could rely upon forever after World War II gave way to a system in which it was normalized to take neighbors' countries by force and commit flagrant human rights violations, acts of genocide as we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think that despite the craziness that you see on your TV, hopefully within the next few weeks, a more orderly and rational process will unfold, and we will see legislation passed that will provide these additional assistance.
Thank you. And now I turn to General Lute. You mentioned quite ambitious military goals in your paper, military task, I would say. What do you think? How it was received in the Pentagon? How was it received among your colleagues? Should Ukraine expect more military aid, stronger military aid, as you indicate in your paper? You're welcome.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say that you should expect this. The purpose of the paper was to lay out an ambitious program, because we appreciate that the Washington Summit is only 9 months from now. And that between now and the Washington Summit, there's hard fighting in front of Ukraine. So actually, even well before Washington, you need the kinds of military support that are laid out in the paper. And if we provide that level of support, we'll be in a much better political position by Washington to make the kinds of political moves that Sandy Vershbow outlined. So these are not disconnected initiatives. These are mutually supporting initiatives. right, on the military front and the political front. I can tell you that in our project, we had, I think, 2 former Supreme Allied Commanders in Europe, 2 former 4-star Army officers who, actually, one's an Air Force officer. We won't hold that against him. But 2 former SACEURs, if you will, and they were very vocal among our group that this is not a reasonable way to pursue a military campaign. This we refer to as incrementalism, or sort of a step-by-step approach. It makes no sense based on military history and military science. We as Americans would never pursue a campaign under these conditions if we were fighting. So that's one of the reasons that when you see the list of 40 people who signed up to support this memo to the president, you see some very prominent military advice. And so we're hopeful that even though we are in the retired ranks now, that we can have an influence with those who are still on active duty, and in particular those who are advising our civilian authorities. So we think there's good military science behind this memo.
Good. And now I would like to invite our prominent audience to ask their questions. So I will start from Ambassador Charlie. You're welcome. We have a microphone over there. If the lady would like to give this microphone to Ambassador Charlie, you're welcome.
Thank you, Danilo. And first of all, I would like to ask us to apply of those who implement your first part of your agenda, defend our country, defend European security, our brave men and women in our defense forces. Please, audience, apply them because it's broadcast in all the country, our discussion now. My question, probably would be not predictable because I want to ask you about negative scenario. The scenario that's not included in your memo, but it's frankly still exists. In case if Ukraine will be not proposed political decision invited to membership in NATO, which impact it will have on position of Russia, in position of European allies, and in position of people in Ukraine and the United States. Because now we have 100 support, not 100, but more than 90% support in Ukraine, membership in NATO. We have in the United States the majority of the people support. So it's my question, and another very connected with that. Danilo asked you about your home agenda, but I wanted to ask it in another manner. Do you think it should be more involvement in this process that you are a leader, take this leadership, thank you, we appreciate that, more involvement in Congress, other players on the Hill and in the United States, not only White House, Congress, lobby, military. By the way, General Lute, probably you share with us how this, how it would be accepted in these groups. And finally, once again, it's only option. It's really only option. And if Danilo allow me to ask Arseniy Yatsenyuk as founder of this forum, just want to ask, Mr. Yatsenyuk, do you think we should prepare the symmetrical memo for Ukrainian president? Because we know this now we have more activity in Plan B. Guarantees is good, but what about Plan A? Thank you.
That's a good idea. I like it. I like it very much. Do you think? Do you want someone specifically to answer the question, or everyone?
I mean, ambassadors. I don't know, Mr. Herbst or Mr. Vershbow, but definitely about lobby of military lobby to General Lute.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks very much. Good to see you again. If Ukraine doesn't get this additional step forward that we're proposing, yes, it would probably be disappointing. I don't think it would be the end of the road. Let's remember that NATO has done a lot, and the allies individually have done a lot when it comes to military support, when it comes to at least simplifying the process for NATO accession. So it's not the glass that's half empty. I think it's a glass half full. But it would still be interpreted in Moscow as a sign of wavering NATO commitment or wavering NATO support to Ukraine. Certainly Russian propaganda would try to put the accent on that. But we would just have to kind of take a deep breath and continue to work using the existing framework to prepare the ground for membership. But I think it would be a missed opportunity. So I'm hoping that your scenario will not arise. And a lot depends, that's your second question regarding, with respect to US leadership. Frankly, what made a more ambitious decision at Vilnius impossible was caution on the part of the White House and a few other allies who were also cautious or hiding behind the US. But I think that most head counts were that the vast majority of NATO allies were ready to support a more ambitious approach. So hopefully US leadership that was not quite sufficient the last time around will be visible in the run-up to the Washington Summit.
Thank you. General, would you like to add?
So with regard to military advice inside the United States, you know, in our tradition, military advisors present their views to civilian leaders, and they always do that behind closed doors. So actually the door of the White House Situation Room or the door of the Oval Office. That's how military advice is provided. But the result of that advice is up to civilian authority. And I think clearly the memo that we wrote is addressed to the right person, the President of the United States. Because in our system, as in yours, he's the Commander-in-Chief, and he's the one who receives military advice, must consider it alongside other priorities, right, and ultimately makes a decision. I would offer that there's no serving military officer that I know, and I know all the senior U.S. military officers. Lloyd Austin is my West Point classmate, as an example, as Secretary of Defense. I don't know anyone who's offering military advice that would suggest that this is good military science, the way that we're approaching support to Ukraine. In the past, there's been a concern about escalation, right? So part of the rationale has been, well, we can't afford to run the risk of providing this system or that system because it might provoke an escalation, which we want to avoid. But I think we've now got over 600 days of history that time and time again, we have provided levels of military support and we have not seen escalation. I think if Vladimir Putin had the capacity to escalate, he would have already done so. Right. And he has not, okay? And to me, that signals that he has limited capacity to escalate. I mean, frankly, what more is he going to do? He's bombing Ukrainian cities. He's killing Ukrainian civilians. He's committing war crimes. So what escalation do we fear? And so I have confidence that our military authorities are providing candid military advice to civilian authorities. And that's why this memo is addressed to the President of the United States.
There was the third part of that, the third question asked by Ambassador Charlie and addressed to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, but I also would like to invite Ivanka to answer that question. So what do you think about an idea of suggesting a similar or very close, subject to the President of Ukraine? What would be your advice to the Ukrainian government? You're welcome.
The memo that we are discussing right now, it goes to the Oval. Whether we need to have a separate memo which goes to the Square office, because we don't have the Oval. Frankly, here is the thing. I believe no. And here is the reason why. We need to undertake concerted actions. Ukraine can have a separate plan. This is to be a joint, comprehensive plan agreed by everyone in NATO, mainly by the flagship or the beacon of the free world, which is the United States, and other allies. And my guess is that the incumbent administration, they have to jumpstart this process as quick as possible right now, in order to launch the large-scale and full-fledged negotiations, both under the table, on the table, everywhere, to get to a consensus. What kind of real deliverables Ukraine is to get in Washington? Because once again, I want to reiterate that Washington Summit is to be a focal point, focal historic point for the Ukrainian people and for NATO too.
Thank you. Ivanka, what's your take?
You know, we have proven over this period of time that some things that have seemed to be totally impossible are already history. They are done and they are being built upon. One of the examples, that's the candidate status for Ukraine in the EU membership. And I hope that by the end of this year also the decision on opening the accession talks on EU membership will be also open for Ukraine. And 2 years ago, I think you would not find anyone who would say that this is going to become a reality. So I think that that is a result of several things. And one of the ingredients of that result is, you know, we can obviously, we do understand that first and foremost that was the great bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian defense forces. But one of the ingredients from my perspective is when all the layers of the Ukrainian authority, starting from the president, the cabinet of ministers, the parliament, all the people from the non-governmental society, all the actors, you know, on different public diplomacy tracks, everybody was engaged in this effort, trying to reach one concrete goal. And that resonated, and that also was got some very positive response also among our partners. So I think that here we probably, I would agree with Arseniy that it's important that we all here, I think in this hall, we are all like-minded people. We do believe that the only possibility for Ukraine to have any security in the future is to become a NATO member. Moreover, we believe that that's the only way for any sustainable and durable peace on this continent, in this part of the world, for Ukraine to be part of NATO. So if we do have some potential possible instrument how to reach it, I think everybody has to be engaged in this advocacy campaign. So it's more about maybe our effort here should be trying to actually reach to the president of Ukraine saying, okay, we are ready to re-engage again all together, and we have to understand that only this concerted common effort will give us the result. And one more thing. I'm very glad that it resonates here in this panel that the unity of the NATO member countries is dependent not only on the, on the personal decision of each member state, even though we understand that this is a consensus decision, but it depends very much on the leaders of the alliance with their taken decisions. If the decision in Washington, I mean not in the summit, but in Washington, D.C., or if the decision in Berlin, if these decisions are taken with regard to looking for the ways how to integrate Ukraine, integrate, provide for clear membership path is taken, I'm sure that then we can also concentrate not exclusively on on some ways of how to deal with this issue during the Washington Summit, but actually getting every single member state on board. And that's where we have to focus.
Let me just add to what Ivana just said, because it's very important. Timing is very important here. You might say, well, the Washington Summit, this is in July of next year. Why are we worried about this now? Well, NATO needs to use every meeting between now and the summit to begin to build the kind of consensus that's required to get this decision done. So there's a foreign ministers meeting coming up. There will be a NATO-Ukraine consul at the foreign ministers level at that foreign ministry meeting. There'll be a defense ministers meeting early in the new year. There'll be another foreign ministers meeting. There are routine meetings of the newly formed NATO-Ukraine consul. Every one of these have to be ambitious in their agenda in order to get where we want to be by July. One of the challenges in Vilnius is that we did not start, in my view, early enough to form consensus. And then Vilnius was upon us, and we were dissatisfied. We were not pleased, right? Well, let's not make that mistake again. Let's get going now. And that's why we published early, 9 months out, so we can begin to build this consensus.
Great. And for that reason, the Atlantic Council, together with the Kyiv Security Forum, have already started the process. Wonderful. And now I turn to the questions from the audience. I see a number of raised hands, and I would like to invite Foreign Minister Hrysko to ask his question.
Thank you so much. Arseniy just mentioned that he was among those who signed 2008 a letter asking NATO to render Ukraine map. I was the exactly person who brought this letter to NATO Secretary General. And after that, I fully agree with what Arseniy has said, that there was Georgia August 2008, then it was Crimea 2014, then it was Syria 2015, and then it was many, many other crimes. Behind all of those, we see Russia. Coming back to your paper, I would like to say that it is really a new approach how to at least speed up the process of the Ukraine's NATO accession. But on the other hand, and I can agree with many ideas you have proposed, on the other hand, in my view, you have missed the main point. And this point is about the transformation of Russia. Let us imagine that Ukraine tomorrow is full member NATO state. What about the global threat from the Russian Federation? It is the same. So probably as a next step, it would be not bad to think about the transformation of the Russian Federation, because in this present form, it will be the threat forever. Thank you.
I believe that Ambassador Herbst is ready to answer that easy question. What should we do with Russia?
I think you raised an important question. And I think the kernel of an answer to your question, in fact, is in the paper. Because we talk about the danger to critical American interests of the Kremlin's current foreign policy. And so if we understand that that is the problem, it's not a problem of what's happening in Ukraine, it's a problem of Russian aggression, which is not limited to Ukraine, then the answer is a strong American policy in coordination with our allies and partners to make sure that Moscow's aggressive tendencies are kept in check. That's the first point. But your suggested answer goes beyond that, and you talk about the transformation of Russia. Now, I'll say something that may not be so popular in this very interesting room. I don't think that outsiders can, in fact, affect domestic transformation in Russia, or for that matter, almost any other country. And I think that one lesson I hope Washington has taken from our less than successful foreign policy in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, is that such a item is extraordinarily difficult. Having said that, that doesn't mean that our plausible efforts to contain Kremlin aggression, to stop it, has no domestic impact. I am a student of Russian history, among other things. And, you know, I've learned after the Crimean War, which did not go too well for the Tsar, after the Russo-Japanese War, which was another misadventure for the Tsar, after World War I, which was another defeat for the Russian army, there were significant changes in Russia involving, at least for a time, liberalization, decentralization. And of course, you can say the same thing happened at the end of the Cold War. So I think there will be at least a temporary change in Russian domestic politics once they lose this war in Ukraine. And as long as American and Western support for Ukraine stays where it is, although our effort is to make sure it gets stronger and smarter, the Kremlin will lose. And there will be changes in Russia, which in theory could be encouraged beyond the defeat of aggressive Russian foreign policy to provide for a Russia which is willing to live with its neighbors. I'm not betting on that last part, so we need to be vigilant throughout. And as long as that happens, I suspect we can manage the dangers posed by those tendencies, imperial tendencies in Russia.
I see. General, would you like to? Sandy?
That we didn't make this point explicitly in our paper, but if Russia wins or succeeds, even to a limited extent, in its effort to subjugate Ukraine, it makes positive change in Russia even less likely down the road. So we certainly can't influence Russian internal developments, except perhaps on the margin. But defeating Putin would be the best step forward towards that goal.
Right, right. And I would like to invite, I see all the hands that you raised, and we will give you a chance to ask your questions, and I would like to invite Prime Minister Groisman to ask what he wants.
Доброго дня. Я не збирався виступати, але мене надихнуло.
Good afternoon. I was not going to speak, but I was inspired by the presentation and the following discussion. And I don't actually have a question, I just have the words of gratitude to address to Arseniy Yatsenyuk and the others. Mr. Yatsenyuk has been dealing with issues of security for quite a long time, and what is going on here at this platform is of crucial importance. I took part in the discussions at this forum for many times, and we always spoke about security, and the dynamics of this discussion shows that this issue of security is not just a topic which some 10 years ago was kind of predictable, have become a reality, and hence we are holding this meeting today in a shelter, which is a very graphic sign. But I thank Arseniy for paying so much attention to security issues, which is absolutely crucial. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for everything you do for Ukraine, and a lot of things we've done in Ukraine were done with your support and assistance. Back in 2008, when there was a summit which was supposed to adopt a pivotal decision, was a failure, and 6 years after that summit, a terrible thing happened, because previously everyone had spoken that we should not anger Russia and so on, but after that Russia went ahead, annexed Crimea, and engaged in other very aggressive actions. And the failure of the world to respond to that encouraged them to go further, while we were crying out that there's a real threat. At the same time, there was an axis of evil being born, and this axis is trying to destroy our world, to destroy us now, and to destroy our values. And this axis of evil is very strong. Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, North Korea, China, for that matter. These are all those who want to make sure that the world should forget about democracy. And I should point out that the battle for our values is going on the territory of Ukraine, and each Ukrainian soldier is paying a price for that. If some people think that the developments in Israel and Ukraine are not related, this is not the case, because the roots of these problems are very similar. We are facing an unprecedented challenge. It's not just about deterrence of Russia. Well, obviously, NATO is largely about deterrence, containment, and defense. But what happened after the beginning of the large-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine? Finland and Sweden said that they wanted to join NATO. Likewise, if the same thing had happened in 2008, we cannot speak about the past, but we can predict that probably Russia would not have attacked Ukraine, and this axis of evil would not have been such aggressive and destructive as it is now. The work which was done by the Atlantic Council and this two-part plan should be commended not just as a bold agenda, but as a plan of realistic victory of Ukraine and the democratic world in this unprovoked and very unjust war. This is a plan of victory which includes two parts. The first one is about Ukraine's accession to NATO, and the examples that you cited during your presentations, Germany and so on, show that this is doable. And the second point is weapons. Ukraine needs F-16. Everyone in Ukraine speaks about F-16. We discussed this for 6 months, and then the political decision is taken, and then for another 6 months to a year, the pilots get trained, and we are losing time in the meantime. I believe that the summit, which is to take place in Washington, should be so clear-cut and straightforward, like the speech of President Biden, which was cited today time and time again. Everything is very logical and straightforward. We have a chance to make sure that in 2024 we prevail in this war and stop Russia. And what our military is doing is really incredible. And in combination with this two-part plan that you present today, we can come very close to this victory. But there are risks on our way, and they make our progress more difficult. One risk is the nuclear weapons of Russia. But this is a global issue which we have to find an answer to. But we are duty-bound to prevail, and I am sure that the plan that you've presented today and the one that you are working on together with Mr. Yatsenyuk will be a very robust foundation for the right decision. So the year 2024 should become a year of victory through political leadership, and real political leadership, which very often is forgotten. Thank you, and I wish all of us victory.
I see Ambassador Alexandrovich would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Danilo. I'm Alexander Alexandrovich, ambassador at the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. I believe it was General Milley who said in April 2022 that we must weaken Russia so much that it would not be able to ever attack any of its neighbors again. My question to you is, what does it mean in practical terms? And linked to this question is the second one: how would you see Ukraine's victory? Is it enough to restore our sovereignty and territorial integrity, or should we go one step further and think about Russia's demilitarization and denuclearization in addition to NATO expansion as the best guarantee against any future Russian aggression. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Who would like to answer that question?
Well,
You're welcome.
on the first part of that question, what did General Milley mean? I often find myself wondering, what did General Milley mean? So I can't speak to that directly. But I believe the short answer is that he meant that we must provide Ukraine what's necessary for Ukraine to do what you just said, which is take back all of its territory, back to 1991 borders, and that action, that military victory, will weaken Russia significantly. I mean, already there are estimates that Ukrainian defense forces have caused about 50% attrition of Russian ground force capability. That's approaching the point of defeat in military terms. So it goes right back to our paper. If we provide what Ukraine needs in quality, quantity, and in the timeline that it's needed, your forces have proven that they will defeat Russia on Ukrainian territory. And that's, I think, what General Milley was referring to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to add? Sandy, you're welcome.
I'm not going to interpret General Milley either, but in terms of defining Ukrainian victory, in everything that I've written and what the Atlantic Council has advocated, it's not only restoring Ukraine's 1991 borders and driving out all Russian forces and reestablishing the status quo ante, but it's also ensuring that Ukraine has the capacity, hopefully the overwhelming capacity, to deter any further Russian aggression in the future and defeat Russia if it attacks. That Ukraine by itself will need help, and that's why NATO membership, as others have agreed, is the only ultimate guarantee of Ukraine's ability to secure a victory once it achieves it. So I'm very pleased to hear so much positive commentary on our proposal. We hope that something along these lines can get approved at the Washington Summit.
Thank you. Thank you. We have around 10 minutes to, unfortunately, we need to finish the event, but nevertheless, we have 3 questions, and you're going to ask your questions. A gentleman behind Foreign Minister Ohrysko, you're welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Michael Ashura, I'm with Newsweek for now. Hypothetically, October 23rd, 2024, Ukraine is admitted into NATO, recognizing the territory that it physically controls. I'm happy, you're happy, it's great. What happens 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later when the first Shahed drone hits a grain storage facility in Odessa? What is the response of the alliance so that a week after that, it's not an apartment building in Vinica?
Thank you. You're welcome. Who would like to answer that question?
I mean, the short answer to this question is that we don't believe it's feasible right now to get to your premise, which is that Ukraine is a member in next year. What we believe is feasible, and actually it's a bit of a stretch goal, is to do as the paper suggests, which is to lay out a positive step forward towards that day when Ukraine will be a member. And it's because of the scenario you outlined that we don't believe in July of next year that NATO will be at consensus with regard to membership. But we do believe, as the paper lays out, that it's practical that we can take an important step in that direction. But it's exactly because of the problem, because Russia's not yet defeated, and because beyond defeat, it's not yet deterred from further attacks, that we don't believe we can gain consensus. So we aim for something short of that, which we still think is a positive step and perhaps practical.
Would you like to elaborate on that? Ambassador Vershbow.
I think one point that we haven't made is that when the day comes, and I hope it's as early as 2024, but it may not be 2024, that Ukraine becomes a member and is covered by the Article 5 guarantee, that an early Russian test of NATO's credibility would fail. I'm not to predict how NATO would respond, but that NATO would respond in the spirit of Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all. And we would do what's necessary. Hopefully deterrence would work, but if not, allies would have to take action.
So Ambassador Vershbow said that when the day comes, Russia would definitely understand that its missile is headed against NATO member country. And now, I beg your pardon, now we have two more questions. Ambassador Turansky, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. I am Ambassador retired, Turansky. I spent 41 years on diplomatic service of Ukraine, having behind my back. And I would like to say that I appreciate the position of Atlantic Council and Arseniy Yatsenyuk Foundation to begin to discuss the question about the future agenda for Washington Summit in 2024, just almost 10 months before. It is very important. Coming to this discussion, I expected that we will watch at least online Ambassador of Ukraine to United States and Ambassador of Ukraine to NATO in Brussels in order to listen to hear their position concerning the future work of this summit. Because for 15 years, we have the open door for membership of Ukraine in NATO, but no positive result. This is a position of NATO like the dog's tail, in one direction, in the second direction. Distinguished Arseniy Yatsenyuk said that he is sure that Ukraine will be members of NATO during the Washington Summit in 2024. But I would like to say, Mr. Secretary, if not, do you have, at least in your foundation, the plan B? What can we do? And how do you plan to stimulate the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, and Office of the President to work? Because according to information in internet, 25 countries are in favor of membership of Ukraine in NATO. But we need to persuade the United States, at least France, Germany, and we have in brackets also at least Hungary. What can we do during these 10 months in order to have the positive result of the membership of Ukraine in NATO, like you have your very nice, very good prediction? Thank you.
Thank you. Arseniy would like to answer that question.
Here is the thing. We are doing what we can, but it's in the hands of the administration, of the president, of both presidents, and of the entire NATO, actually to come to a consensus. I want to be very clear. What I believe in, I believe that during Washington Summit, Ukraine is to get an invitation which is completely similar to the start of the accession talks. That's what I believe in. And the reason, whether you're correct saying that we need to have plan B, but that's not plan B, that's plan C, which is capitulation. It starts with the same letter, because everyone is closely watching. Chinese, Russians, even Global South, everyone is closely watching whether the United States is still the leader of the free world, whether the free world is ready to defend itself, whether the free world really has guts to defend democracy, freedom, liberty, even actually the life of the human being, whether the free world is ready to fight for justice. It's not going to be our fault. This is to be the fault of the entire free world. And this would be the victory of the autocrats, totalitarian regimes like Putin and the rest of these bloody world. So this is my answer. There is no other option for the free world, but there are a number of plan Bs for the totalitarian and autocratic regimes.
I thank you. So I saw there was a, yes, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, Igor Brelyan, Analyst Detector Media. And actually, when we're talking about Ukraine and NATO membership, we need to talk also about the Black Sea security, because during the last 20 years, NATO hasn't been able to form its own Black Sea strategy. And what do you think, can we expect until the Washington Summit that NATO will form its Black Sea strategy?
And should it be a separate part of the strategy with regards to Ukraine? So, gentlemen, who would like to answer this question?
I think I can begin to answer that. So NATO recently approved a regional plan for the defense of its allies that border the Black Sea. A critical advantage of bringing Ukraine into NATO would be that, in effect, NATO would have control of the Black Sea because of the Ukrainian coastline and Crimea and so forth. But there is a plan, but it's limited to those countries along the Black Sea that are currently NATO allies. And this is why it's so important from a NATO strategic perspective to bring Ukraine into the alliance.
Thank you. As we approach the end of our interesting discussion, and I would like to thank you all for your contribution, I would like to invite every distinguished speaker of our panel to say the most important message that you would like to send to the Ukrainian and American audience today here in Kyiv, in this parking place, protecting us against the Russia's threats. Ambassador Herbst, you're welcome.
With the House of Representatives not in session, and the implications for assistance to Ukraine, and for that matter to Israel, at stake, it's important to remind you that we meaning the Americans, will get through this difficult period. I think that Biden's speech from the Oval Office last night is a clear indication that we are on the rebound, that there will be a package of assistance to Ukraine and to Israel and also to Taiwan, and American global leadership will be vindicated. As long as what I've said is true, Putin will be defeated. And if we can help speed up the provision of more effective weapons in prompt time, right numbers, that will also have an impact on a better outcome at the NATO summit and a faster victory for Ukraine.
Thank you.
This is just a wonderful venue. Well done, KSF.
Thank you. Ambassador Vershbow.
Yeah, I agree on the congratulations to the KSF. I come away with a sense of encouragement by the discussion that we've had. I think that the search will continue for what I think was Arseniy described as something that's in between idealistic and realistic in terms of the decisions that we can ultimately hope to see at the Washington Summit. But clearly we need to go farther. Now, someone said that 28 NATO members are for Ukrainian membership and 2 are against. That's not, in fact, the correct description of the situation. All the members of NATO have declared many times that they're for Ukrainian membership in NATO. What they can't agree on is the when and the how. But we hope that the approach that we've suggested, or some variation on it that Ukraine might help us develop, could get us to the point of consensus in the alliance, and sending a message to Mr. Putin that he's not going to just wait us out or bully us or try to intimidate us with his nuclear saber rattling. We're going to proceed to take decisions that are in our mutual interest, and that's what this is all about.
Thank you.
The last point I'd make is that President Biden talks about this moment in history as an inflection point, right? A pivotal moment, a time where what follows will look a lot different than what preceded. And if, in fact, that's the case, if we are at a historical pivot point, then in my view, it makes these decisions that we're talking about easy decisions. If this is a strategic pivot point, then we clearly should be providing Ukraine what it needs to win on the battlefield. If this is a strategic pivot point, then let's secure the future by laying out a clear roadmap for Ukrainian membership in NATO, which in our view is the only way we can really secure the European future. So if this is really a pivot point, let's act like it.
Thank you. Ivana.
I think there are several things that are important for us to agree upon. First, that Russia does not need to be provoked in order to escalate. And we have to understand that only it does again and again, I will repeat it like, I don't know, 1,000 times, that Russia only understands the language of strength, power, and unity. And that's exactly what we have to rely upon. Secondly, I think that everybody here agrees that we do have the task to ensure that in Washington Summit of NATO, we will not end up with another repetition of open door policy. That we do have to reach the point that our relationship with NATO is taken to that point that is called at least, and let's put it at least, an invitation for Ukraine to start the accession talks. And the third point is that we once again have to understand the urgency of the need to mobilize ourselves and continue and reinforce our systemic work on all levels in order to achieve that goal, and in different capitals as well.
Thank you. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk.
You know, some would argue the reason why the Atlantic Council, and we actually together with the Atlantic Council decided to make this presentation right now. And the answer is very, very simple. It takes 9 months to give the birth to the human life. In this particular case, I believe that it will take 9 months to give the birth to the historic decision, which is to be made in Washington.
Good point.
To provide to Ukraine a clear-cut membership perspective and to start an accession process. No doubt that the fact that we are right now in this Parkin Valley sitting and discussing the NATO perspectives for Ukraine is that it's up to the Ukrainian military and to the Ukrainian people. It's due to the Ukrainian people and to the Ukrainian armed forces that gave us this chance to sit in Kyiv to discuss the future of Ukraine. And they deserve the credit. And I want to be very clear saying that, look, and the American people, the American leadership, you deserve the credit too. So I believe in our strong joint future.
I thank you very much. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, and I would like to thank our beloved audience for your important questions. That was a good meeting. That's a good beginning of the important story. Thank you very much. Дуже дякую.